Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air for the 24th week of 2015. Our program is presented by members and friends of Aware, a local peace group. Aware is an acronym for Anti-War, Anti-Racism Effort. I'm Carl Estabrook. Many Americans are unaware that the Obama administration is making war in 8 countries around the world, 2 more than George Bush. Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, and the Philippines, in violation of the Charter of the United Nations, which forbids, quote, the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state without the authorization of the UN Security Council. Most of us are unaware that President Obama is sending American death squads, special operation forces, into more than 100 countries around the world, where their operations include kidnapping, we call it rendition, torture, and murder. We'll hear more about that from Szoke in a few minutes. Most Americans are unaware that the U.S. President is conducting the most extreme terrorist campaign of modern times, a secret series of murders by drone that has already killed thousands, including American citizens and hundreds of children. And most of us don't know that the Obama administration is recklessly provoking war with Russia in Ukraine, where a U.S. proxy government has already killed thousands, more than U.S. client Israel killed in Gaza last year, and with China in the South China Sea. These U.S. wars are not in the interest of the vast majority of Americans, who are taxed to pay for them and forced to forego government services, to the point that the U.S. is now the most unequal developed country, and is becoming more so, and at an increasing rate. But the wars are in the interest of a very few Americans, the very rich, the 1%, who profit enormously from U.S. control of the world economy. There are 2 areas that the U.S. particularly plans to control: the Mideast and Eurasia, which are connected by their possession of world energy supplies, gas and oil. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, which also has 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. U.S. control over world energy flows gives it leverage over our economic rivals, from Germany to China. Since World War II, the U.S. has demanded control over, not just access to, Mideast gas and oil, and our government has been willing to kill a lot of people to ensure it. Wars conducted by U.S. presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings in the last 50 years, mostly civilians. Obama was elected on a platform of hope and change, but he's brought little hope and almost no change to U.S. war policy, except perhaps to lie more successfully about what he's doing than George Bush did. Obama's work for the 1%, and against the interests of the rest of us, is nowhere better illustrated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the secret trade deal with 11 countries that he's trying to rush through Congress on a fast track, that is, with no congressional amendment allowed. In fact, the TPP is not primarily about trade. It's about increasing corporate profits, stopping governments from regulating corporations, and making people throughout the world pay more for intellectual property, medicine, software, etc. It's designed to carry forward the neoliberal project to maximize profit and business domination, to set working people in the world in competition with one another so as to lower wages, increasing the economic insecurity of the majority, and to protect the top wealth sector. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is not concerned with the traditional concepts of trade agreements, such as lowering tariffs and increasing imports or exports. Instead, the TPP seeks to undermine regulations in sectors like food safety, medicine, and intellectual property by limiting government's ability to legislate within their own countries. By entangling such provisions with an agreement on international trade, the Obama administration would open up sovereign countries to unprecedented levels of interference by multinational corporations. We'll hear more about this in a minute from Stuart Levy. It's significant that countries which had been ravaged by such globalization, leading to massively expanding inequality, like Brazil and India, refused to join the trade agreement. We should be warned. Champaign-Urbana Aware recommends you contact the President and our representatives in Congress and tell them, 1, stop killing people around the world. 2, bring all U.S. troops home from their mission of protecting the profits of the 1%. And 3, stop trying to rig the international economy to the benefit of the rich and the detriment of the rest of us. The AWARE web page and Facebook page have email addresses and phone numbers for President Obama, Senator Dick Durbin, Senator Mark Kirk, and Representative Rodney Davis. Also for our members of the state legislature, for reasons we'll mention later. Rodney Davis, our congressional representative, has a Washington, D.C. office at 202-225-2371. And that's worth a phone call because the House will vote this week, maybe even today, on the fast track arrangement that the president wants in order to exclude Congress from conversation on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and Congress seems willing to go along with that. So call Congressman Davis, Representative Davis, at 202-225-2371 and say that our elected representatives should have some say over what the arrangements for corporate profits that President Obama is making around the world. Tonight we'll talk about war making particularly, which the government and media aren't talking about, with commentaries by Ron Szoke, Trigger Warnings, Karen Aram, The Pivot to Asia, Stuart Levy, Call Me Pro-Sovereignty, and David Green, Religion and War. That should cover it. We'll start with Ron Szoke, Trigger Warnings.
Yes, well, this is a term that has turned up in a number of campuses where students think they should be protected from hearing anything that would cause them any personal distress. So there's even a case of a law school professor who was told not to assign the usual section on rape law because it was so, reading about rape was so upsetting to the female law students and so on. So now some of the students are asking for trigger warnings if there's anything in the material that they're supposed to study that might cause them any kind of distress or upset or the like. So that's what we've sunk to, and in the attempt to be sensitive and ward off accusations of microaggression, we're talking now about civility and the need to punish anyone who is saying anything that seems uncivil. And there's a lot of double talk going on. We're hearing constantly in the local daily, for example, about protecting freedom of speech from the horrible liberals and leftists who are trying to suppress it. And yet you turn the page and there'll be another piece saying that how can they expect to be protected from people who might be upset and distressed by what they say? So they better start taking responsibility for it, and they know perfectly well what the consequences will be. What we'll hear from the more highly placed people about these irresponsible things that are being said, and whoever is saying them must, of course, be punished. My main topic today is a piece that appeared in the New York Times a day or two ago about SEAL Team 6, the Navy unit that has apparently been substantially, well, it's part now of the Joint Special Operations Command, JSOC, which has been assigned to the CIA, freeing them essentially of military discipline. And they have been turned loose in a number of cases. In this article by Mark Mazzetti and others, I have to bring it back up here, to carry on their operations in a number of places while maintaining deniability. That's become the operative phrase. And carrying out assassinations, killings all over the world as needed. They get all of the assignments about taking down people that the Pentagon or the White House considers troublesome. Inside Team 6, there were initially 2 assault groups called Blue and Gold, after the Navy colors. Blue used the Jolly Roger pirate flag as its insignia, and early on earned the nickname the Bad Boys in Blue for racking up drunken driving arrests, abusing narcotics, and crashing rental cars on training exercises with near impunity. young officers were sometimes run out of Team 6 for trying to clean up what they perceived as a culture of recklessness. So there are a number of accounts here of the killings that they've carried out, the mutilation of the bodies afterwards, and the attempts, mostly successful, to keep all of this secret from the rest of the military and indeed, of course, from the American public. So just a couple of more paragraphs in this article, which everyone should read, especially if they're feeling superior to, that USA is somehow morally superior to what the fascists did in Germany in the 1930s and 40s, when one of the most talked about units there was the Totenkopf, the SS unit called the Death's Head, and their insignia, again, the Death's Head, the skull and crossbones, was adopted by the Nazis, appearing on many of their uniforms. And actually, it's been adopted and adapted slightly in an American military unit also, in the Air Force, the Missile Squadron 400. And you can see online, if you look for it, what that uniform is like. It's festooned also with the Death's Head. Team 6 members often operate under the watchful eyes of their commanders, officers at overseas operations centers and at Domnek can routinely view live surveillance feeds of raids provided by drones high above, but they're also given wide latitude. While special operations troops functioned under the same rules of engagement as military personnel in Afghanistan, Team 6 members, again operating under the CIA, routinely performed their missions at night, making life or death decisions in dark rooms with few witnesses and beyond the view of a camera. And it goes on and on. Again, I can't begin to convey the full meaning and weight of this in the time available. This is going to remain, I'm afraid, incoherent and unconvincing. But if you think there's some doubt about what's being reported here, you should read the article for yourself. Again, New York Times, the head is SEAL Team 6, A Secret History of Quiet Killings and Blurred Lines by Mark Mazzetti and others. And I recommend it to you if you are all curious about what's actually been going on. That's all.
Thank you, Ron. I think the rest of us would like a chance to comment on both points you raise, important as they indeed are. What we'll do is go around. We all have various comments, and we'll go back around again for comments on the comments, so to speak. So we'll go now to Karen Aram and pivot to Asia.
Well, actually, our pivot to Asia now is, which actually referred to, excuse me, in the past, by the Obama administration as containment and integration. That's now been changed to a policy of intimidation, incitement, and confrontation. And I'm taking this from an article in Counterpunch on June 8th by Mike Whitney. The title is Beating Uncle Sam at His Own Game. And basically, he refers to the vast buildup of military assets in the Asia-Pacific, which signals a fundamental change in U.S. policy towards China. Recent actions taken by China, particularly the announcement that it planned to launch an Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which we have discussed previously, that's the AIIB, that would compete head-to-head with the World Bank and IMF. This set off alarms in the capital, where behind-the-scenes power brokers and think tank pundits agree that a more robust policy is needed to slow China's ascendancy. Now, the U.S. does not want a war with China. We don't believe, okay? That's probably not. What it wants is to be the dominant player in this century's most promising and prosperous market, Asia. And they think China will back down rather than face the awesome military power of the American empire. But will it? That's questionable. And I think we rely too much upon China's restraint and good sense. Basically, I have an article or a paragraph here to quote from Ashton Carter, our current Defense Department head, but you know what? I don't think I want to quote it, okay? Everything he has said is so, one minute he says that, he doesn't see that any problems or that we need to do anything militaristic, but then he immediately starts going through and detailing all of our weaponry and all of our military arsenal. And I mean, if that isn't a provocation, I don't know what is. But basically, China is building the world's greatest economic development and construction project ever undertaken. That's the New Silk Road, again, which we've discussed frequently. And the project aims at no less than a revolutionary change in the economic map of the world. And this is going to be financed by the AIIB. Washington's gambit in the Spratlys, which is what the U.S. is now provoking, that somehow these little sand dunes that China is building on reefs, and they're building some military bases, that somehow this is provoking the U.S. in the South China Sea. And it's not. It's been proven that it's not inhibiting our flights in any way unless we do protrude upon the 12-mile, limit that China, as well as all the other Southeast Asian nations in that area have. Somehow the other nations' 12-mile limit doesn't bother the U.S., only the China 12-mile limit seems to bother them. So Washington's gambit in the Spratlys is an attempt to reverse the tide, derail China's current trajectory, and insert the U.S. as the regional kingpin who writes the rules and picks the winners. And, we are so setting up this Cold War. Cold Wars can often revert into hot wars, and so it is dangerous to provoke a nuclear power. Now, the danger of the AIIB Bank, as Washington sees it, is not simply that it will fund many of the infrastructure projects that will be needed to integrate Europe, Asia, and Africa into one giant free trade zone, but that the bank will replace key U.S.-backed financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank. Okay, I'm going to quote Bart Gruzalski, who's a writer who has an article also in Counterpunch. He notes in his article that China and Russia are creating alternatives that threaten the dollar's status as the sole dominant international currency. By instituting trade alternatives to the dollar, they challenge the value of the dollar and so threaten the U.S. economy. And this means that the U.S. has lost its role as the underwriter of the global economic system. So, and the writer Mike Whitney goes on to say that he can think of no event since Bretton Woods comparable to the combination of China's effort to establish a major new institution and the failure of the U.S. to persuade dozens of its traditional allies, starting with Britain, to stay out. Anyway, the AIIB was the straw that broke the camel's back, that has the Obama administration making what they call crucial changes to our existing policy, which I think we agree poses a serious threat. My take on this, I agree with everything that's in this article. I also want to refer to another article. Morton Brussel, a friend of AWARE, mentioned. He's a member of AWARE. Yeah, right. He mentioned on the Peace List today. I wish he would come and speak, but Tom from TomDispatch.com, and this is an article by Alfred McCoy. It's entitled "Washington's Great Game and Why It's Failing." I love Alfred McCoy ever since 1972. His book on the politics of heroin in Southeast Asia. He is a very detailed and exceptionally good researcher. But it's 24 pages, so we will leave that to another time to discuss.
I'll post that on the Facebook page. So
yeah. But my take on this is that, yes, Washington doesn't want a war. They want China to back down. But here's what bothers me is that, yes, we don't want a war between China and the U.S., but we're remilitarizing Japan. We're setting up military bases all throughout Southeast Asia. We want proxy wars. We've already proven that that's what we do. We've already got Kiev and the Ukraine fight, in battles on Russian territory, Russia and the Ukraine. I mean, these proxy wars are so dangerous. And if you just look back to World War II and you think of 60 million people died, and if you look at the slaughter that took place when the Japanese invaded China, I just can't help think to myself that we are looking at, if not war, we are certainly looking at proxy wars, the way we are remilitarizing and incentivizing and provoking. And I leave it to others to comment.
Thank you, Karen. This is very important indeed. You're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go to our friend Stuart Levy, who wants to be called pro-sovereignty, right? Sure.
I think, so when we talk about these things, as Carl was describing beautifully earlier, these things that call themselves trade agreements. I'm sorry, oh yeah, I don't need to talk into that, just as, fine.
There we go.
When we're talking about these things that get labeled trade agreements, it's a misleading label, but labels are important. I mean, they're intended to mislead in that case. So I think we should pick a more appropriate one. And I think a good label for the family of so-called trade agreements that are being discussed now is anti-sovereignty agreements. They're pro-corporate and anti-national sovereignty. This is a good sort of hook to hang if you're trying to convince a Republican that they are not what they're hooked up to be, or if you're a Republican yourself. So one issue that's very current, there was with respect to similar agreements, is the country of origin labeling for meat, which the U.S. had adopted. Meat was being imported from China, and there were reports of things like use of pesticides or of poor inspection protocols being used in China. And so this was, having country of origin labeling on meat, as for other things, is a way that consumers at least can know who's under whose inspection regime the food was produced and inspected. Well, China sued under the WTO to have that restriction removed, and the WTO within the last few months ruled against the U.S. So probably tomorrow the House may well vote to actually remove country of origin labeling from our laws. So how's that for sovereignty? Public Citizen has a whole collection of similar examples that have been imposed on us by other so-called trade agreements. So in one case, U.S. patent laws were altered to comply with WTO to extend the duration of monopolies given to drug manufacturers. Clean Air Act regulations on gasoline cleanliness were rolled back. The U.S. automobile, the fuel efficiency standards were weakened. Anyhow, there's a whole variety of things like this. There's a similar one pending in Australia now, where Philip Morris, cigarette producer, is suing the Australian government for to remove requirements that they put restrictive labeling on tobacco packaging. So, and then there are some further comments on this from Joe Firestone, who had written to his Democratic U.S. representative in Virginia, and that representative has stated his support for the TPP. As our own rep, Rodney Davis has said he thinks the TPP is a great agreement and a transparent one. He thinks it will improve conditions for selling steel, for U.S. steelmakers to sell steel. Well, that's great, but it will do lots of other things too. A primary feature of this agreement and of others, one which was very recently leaked, which would also be covered by Fast Track Authority, is the Trade and Services Agreement, which would cover all kinds of things, apparently, from financial services. If we want to see our financial system regulated in a way that it might be less likely to collapse again, we would be giving up that sovereignty in undertaking this agreement. I don't know. It just makes me sick to talk about this. So, but what I would urge you to do is, if it makes you sick to hear about it, is to call at least Rodney Davis.
Yes.
As I call his office. I just talked to them today, and the woman I spoke to politely took my comments, saying that I opposed fast track, which would give very rapid approval to all of these agreements, including ones that the public hasn't even been hearing about, like the Trade and Services Agreement. It would limit debate. It would require that there be no amendments. But it would certainly permit the agreements to remain secret. They say right in their own text, the text of the rules in these agreements will not be made public for 5 years after they're adopted. The public won't even know when Congress votes what the agreements even bind us to. We won't find out until probably we get sued by a company who does know exactly what the agreement contains, saying that some U.S. regulation is infringing on their potential profits, and they could, as Ecuador is being sued for $2.5 billion by an oil company, we could be sued for hundreds of billions of dollars, and how would we pay for that? So you could say that you oppose fast track, regardless of what anyone thinks of the bodies of the agreements. There should be public consideration. You should ask Davis to sign on to the letter that would make the text of the agreements public, which he could do. You should ask for public consideration of all these issues before any vote would be even taken on them. When I spoke to Davis's office this morning, the woman I spoke to had not been hearing from anybody on these issues.
Really?
Yeah. So there are other people in the office. I talked to somebody in the local office a week ago, so he certainly had heard about it. But it means they have not been getting very many calls. So please give them calls about fast track, about TPP, about Trade and Services Agreement, and just tell them, go slow, not fast.
Thank you very much, Stuart. This is important, and it is certainly bound up with our remit here to talk about the wars of the United States, because these so-called trade agreements, which are not about trade, as Stuart explained, have a great deal to do with the reasons that the U.S. is killing people around the world and has been doing so for generations. And if that needs to be spelled out, maybe we'll take some time and do that a little later.
Maybe you should have issued a trigger warning. Makes us, making us sick.
You're watching Aware on the Air, and we'll go to David Green for Religion and War.
Okay. I was provoked to come in today to sort of have a little historical corner to the Aware on the Air by some interviews that have been on the Real News Network in a series of interviews about the Vietnam War between Paul Jay, who runs the Real News Network, or started it, and Christian Appy, who is a professor who's written a book, American Reckoning, the Vietnam War and Our National Identity. It's the third book that Appy has written about the Vietnam War. And I went in to try to take a little snippet from these interviews. It's in 5 sections, about 2 hours worth. And I think a good way to review the process by which the Vietnam War happened. I ended up labeling this segment Religion and War because I was led onto a particular snippet and then reminded that there's been another book written recently that talks about the relationship between religion and our national identity. And this is a book by a man named Kevin Kruse, Kruse, called One Nation Under God, How Corporate America Invented Christian America. And then in the spirit of the propaganda era subsequent to World War II, that is the topic of this snippet, I would also remind you of a well-known book, Elizabeth Phone's Wolf, selling free enterprise, the business assault on labor and liberalism, 1945 to 1960. So central to this is the years after World War II, where the American people needed to be scared into war with their former ally, the Soviet Union, allegedly combating them around the Third World. But let me also preface these quotations by saying that I don't believe religion is ever the cause of war per se. I don't believe that the substance of religious beliefs is generally a very good way to explain why we fight wars, why other nations fight wars, why Islamic countries are involved in wars. But I think that this is a complex issue that we need to think about. But what I'm going to talk about today is how religion became implicated in the propaganda of this country after World War II. I'm going to read some excerpts from this interview for which two people are involved, Paul Jay and Christine Appy, the author of this book about Vietnam. Jay says, a little out of context, but I think you'll get the idea. Jay says, in 1955, Eisenhower says, quote, "Without God, there would be no American form of government, nor an American way of life. Recognition of the supreme being is the most basic expression of Americanism." That's the quote from Eisenhower. Then Paul Jay goes on, just a year before that, one nation under God, quote unquote, becomes part of the Pledge of Allegiance. This idea of this merging of God and Americanism and then militarism, Eisenhower has a big role to play in it. And Appy responds, yes, he certainly does. And it's in this period, really, Cold War politics are fused with religious politics, and that the phrase godless communism is as common as communist aggression or atheistic communism. And there really was a religious underpinning to American policy. And Appy goes on, and this is actually maybe the time to introduce the long-forgotten figure named Tom Dooley, who wrote a best-selling book that came out in 1956 called Deliver Us from Evil, which is, of course, a direct quotation from the Lord's Prayer. And what he was writing about was his own experience as a Navy doctor who had been assigned to something called Operation Passage to Freedom, which was a Navy-sponsored plan to help move northern, mostly Catholic refugees, northern Vietnamese Catholic refugees into the South. The goal was really to help build a constituency for the Catholic Neo-Jin Diem, who the United States helped was instrumental in putting into place as the new leader of this country, called South Vietnam. And he tells the story of an unequivocally good versus evil story in which the United States are like missionaries going to rescue these poor and desperate refugees in flight from murderous communists. He tells all these atrocity stories of communists literally jamming, he claims, chopsticks into the eardrums of young Catholic children as they're learning the Lord's Prayer or their catechisms. And then Paul Jay says, and he knew this was all bull. Appy, referring to this fellow Dooley. And Appy says, well, he must have known it was bull because the government went in his wake and tried to find, if they could, any evidence that any of this was true and couldn't. Of course, they didn't tell the American public that they didn't find evidence for it. But he was a fervent believer in the American cause. And some of those stories may have been encouraged by editors at the Reader's Digest, which was a very conservative but also widely read publication in the 1950s, which did have connections to the CIA. And Dooley was befriended by a man who worked with the CIA, who helped ghostwrite much of the book Deliver Us from Evil. And then Paul Jay says, so this is about 1956. And Appy responds, this was 1956. It had a lot of readers, and it was quite influential in spreading this idea that we were embarked on nothing less than a kind of holy mission and non-military and a non-military mission. And it was not in the 1950s. It was not in the 1950s. Americans had no sense that this was leading to some huge bloody war, that this was really an exercise in a kind of benign nation building or economic development, in which we were helping to offer the blessings of freedom and to help South Vietnam achieve its own self-determination. What we slowly learned, and Eisenhower admits in his 1963 memoir, is that we actually sabotaged democracy, a democratic solution in Vietnam in the mid-50s. And Jay says, this was the election in 1956. And Appy responds, there was supposed to be an election in 1956 that had been called for by the Geneva Accords, which was in 1954, which was the international conference that brought an end to the French Indochina War. And one of the stipulations is that will divide Vietnam between North and South, and that isn't to be permanent. It was never intended to be permanent, but that in 2 years' time, after things stabilize, there will be an election to reunite Vietnam under one government. And the reason it didn't go forward is that every intelligence report Eisenhower saw indicated that the communist leader, Ho Chi Minh, was likely to win an overwhelming victory, maybe 80% in the South as well as in the North. And so finally, what Appy says in this interview, so Eisenhower and Ngo Dinh, the American-backed ruler in the South, decided not to have elections and therefore to embark on this 21-year objective to create and bolster a permanent non-communist country called South Vietnam. And of course, in the end, it failed, and it failed primarily because the government and all the ones that followed after his assassination in 1963 never had the sufficient support of its own people, broad enough to defend itself in the absence of massive American military presence.
Thank you, David. This is the history that we need to know about in order to understand America's wars today. As Noam Chomsky says, it's the reason people don't study history. It just teaches you too much. You're watching Aware on the Air, and our plan now is to go around and everybody has a chance to ask some questions about what we've heard so far from the other members of the panel. And I'm going to start by asking Ron about his account of SEAL Team 6, the American death squad that's profiled in Sunday's New York Times. How the hell did this get into the New York Times, Ron?
Yeah, I was curious about that too, because ordinarily the New York Times will not publish anything that it thinks might actually be dangerous to American security interests for the USA or for Israel. But this was uncharacteristic. I'm glad to see it happen, but maybe that line has become just so implausible that at some point the case had to be broken open. And yeah, I must say I was surprised.
Well, I have a theory here. Mark Bozzetti, who is the principal author, has been writing some good stuff on what the U.S. is actually doing around the world. But once again, the question is not what the reporters write, but what the editors decide get into the paper. And I would compare this to a similar remarkable and horrifying article that appeared in May of 2012 about the kill list that President Obama exercises, where he chooses from baseball cards given him by the director of the CIA people to be killed by drones. Obama picks them out. He does it every Terror Tuesday, as they call it in the White House, to figure out who's going to be killed. And he's killed about 5,000 people this way. Now, how is it that these articles get in? It seems to me that there is a sense in the White House right now that their real problem, of course, is criticism from the Republicans and other people in America who are not fully with the president's programs at home and abroad, and therefore they have to counter that, and the way to counter that is to show that the president is tough, to show that the president really is carrying on the war. We've had a version of this argument going on right now in regard to ISIS. the caliphate in Iraq and Syria, there is someone in the administration. There are people in the administration who are working on their media form by saying we have to place articles that show just how tough we really are and how Obama is indeed carrying the war to the terrorists. Now, we know that Obama's characteristic mode he learned on the basketball court: fake left, drive right. Pretend you're doing something progressive and then do something more reactionary than the previous administration. This fits that. That's exactly what the war is, while Obama is giving speeches on Memorial Day saying, of course, our wars are over. We ended the war in Afghanistan, he says, which is a flat lie. His pose for Americans at large is of someone who has stopped the wars of the previous administration, when in fact he's waging more wars than the previous administration did. And I think this fits in with that. Does that seem reasonable?
No, that involves more mind reading than I care to do.
Well, look, there's a media strategy in the White House. They think a good deal. They think very carefully about what they say to the media and when they say it and how they do it. Yeah. I mean, this article does not come as a surprise to the White House.
I don't know whether it does or not, but the editors of the New York Times
well,
make
if
a
you believe
decision.
that, I got a bridge I want to show you.
Yeah, right. Make a decision about what this is a challenge to the fundamental national security interests of the United States. And in some cases, they judge it not so, as in the Pentagon Papers and so on. So, yeah, it is something of a puzzle, but there it is.
Do you want to pose a question to the other panelists? Your turn next.
Yeah. David, I agree that religious belief does not lead directly to war, but it may be an enabling condition. Yeah. Don't you agree? And I think the whole business of belief is vastly overplayed with respect to religion. Religion is not really about beliefs at all, it seems to me. But
what's it about, Ron?
It's about feelings over emotions, the way you situate yourself with respect to nature and the ongoing processes of history. This is a question I've often asked. Sometimes I've conducted classes in comparative religion, and if I mention a certain group, someone will pop up. There was a former professor of astronomy here who did this several times. Well, what do they believe? Which is kind of sneering at them. And to me, what they believe in the terms of theological doctrine is largely irrelevant. It's these doctrines are typically cooked up to deal with some personal or social conflict, and I think they're less important than to any real healthy religion than the fundamental beliefs, not only beliefs, but convictions and feelings that people have about themselves and their relation to each other and to the cosmos.
So that's what a Christian is doing when he recites a creed, or a Jew when he says the Shema? Overwhelming feelings coming out. Huh?
Well, no, again, there's no direct connection like that. It's an expression of relatively superficial expression of something that's far deeper, or should be.
I'm sorry, you asked David a question.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm not a religion. I'm not going to get to the bottom of this. I don't think. But what fascinates me, I mean, religious beliefs can be strongly held, of course, and they may include a historical vision, an apocalyptic vision, lots of things, and certainly have been part of the political discourse of this country, I guess, since the people landed, the Mayflower landed, or even before that. City on the Hill, City on a Hill, which Ronald Reagan liked to quote. But I'm fascinated more by the idea that Christianity, in whatever aspect of that, missionary aspect of that, can be has been wedded to American foreign policy, that it wasn't until after World War II, what some of these people are arguing, that the inclusion of God in the Pledge of Allegiance, which children recite at school every day, was done in this kind of intentionalistic and anti-communist context. I've been further, of course, intrigued by the rise of the Christian right in the 1970s and its fundamental role in the rise of Ronald Reagan and the way that I think these people have been both incorporated and I think a lot of ways used by neoliberalism, by right-wing neoliberalism. I think there's a difference between what Ronald Reagan's handlers really wanted to get done and what the people that voted for him believed in religious terms. So I think there's a lot of complexity there, and religion gets mixed up in that in a way that needs to be sorted out from propaganda, from just crass politics. But obviously, religion, people's religious identities and sense of belonging and sense of conformity and nationalism all get mixed up in ways that can be a relatively toxic brew in the context of any major religion, and probably some minor ones as well.
Yeah, I think Gary Wills has written some interesting stuff along these lines. And there's this guy that appears weekly in the local daily, Cal Thomas, who shows the, to me, completely degenerate side of this. But.
Other comments on this subject, panelists?
Well, yeah, beliefs. I mean, beliefs can be religion, it can be politics, but it has to do, I think, with individual self-identity. And I think that's where we're fighting a battle frequently, is getting people to sort of unleash themselves from that identity and look at facts. And I use the example of climate change. I mean, you'll have people who initially will say, oh, well, I don't believe in climate change, even though 99 out of 100% scientists are saying, here's the facts, there is climate change. Then you have the same people coming back with, well, I don't believe it's man-made. I believe that climate change is cyclical. Well, then you have 99% of the scientists saying, well, man is definitely a contributor and that we can do something about it if we act quickly. And then you have the same people saying, well, then we have to be responsible about what we do so it doesn't affect our industry. So then you have to really look at it and say, okay, what's really going on here? And I'm using climate change as an example of what we call beliefs. I was quite confused, Ron, last week when you were referring to a war, World War II, 60 million people dying. You were saying you didn't use the word relativism, but it sounded to me like you were applying the term relativism to it as being, depending on your perspective as to whether it was a crime, and a crime, like if there's no law, it's not necessarily a crime. So I was very confused by that, given that you've been such a strong advocate against war. Yeah. And I would really like to explore some of this.
That would be another tangent. What I was inveighing against is subjectivism, not relativism. Relativism, properly understood, I will defend. I think it's true.
Even something as egregious as 60 million people being killed in World War II?
No. That's very confused.
Yeah, that's why I'm confused.
I dismiss that entirely.
Okay. You dismissed that you referred to last week.
What I referred to was subjectivism. Relativism is right, but again, if it's properly formulated. But what I was objecting to is trying to base everything on people's feelings. Okay, and that has a place in religion, as I indicated, but in political judgments and so on, it's extremely dangerous, that degree of subjectivism.
You're absolutely sure of that?
No.
You're watching Aware on the Air. Other comments from the panel?
Yeah. All right. Since we're talking about religion, how about this? I mean, is it not right that the word, the original, the Latin word for religion comes for the obligations? Not what you or what you believe. It's named not for what you believe, but for what you're required to do. And along those lines, I'm thinking of of Martin Luther King's Beyond Vietnam speech. I'm sure he said this in other places too, but he stands up, he's speaking against the Vietnam War and says that this is something we are called to do as sons of the living God. You know, he makes the connection between his religion and his opposition to war very direct. So,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, I don't try to derive any great conclusions from the etymology of the word. Religio is about binding together, the sacred tie that binds. And it reappears in other terms like ligature and legato and so on. But that's the idea, that it's a social bond that's important.
Well, let me just bring in what the role of religion might be in the anti-war movement, and let's look around us. What are the churches or religious or organizations in Urbana-Champaign that actively participate in anti-war movements? I know that Channing Murray, as a Unitarian Universalist institution, certainly has offered a space for opposing war. How explicitly it does that in its charter, I guess, probably does. But then again, there's another Unitarian Universalist church which, as far as I can tell, doesn't really participate in debates or sponsor fora about the ongoing wars. Since I've been living here, I've never gone to an event at the UU Church on Green Street in which these issues could be discussed in a political, religious, moral context that one would think that the members of the UU Church would want to hear. And so I guess my question is, why is that?
Yeah, well, I have an offer out to do some of exactly that at the Green Street Church, but we'll see whether that materializes.
And I think this is a debate. I'm not an expert on pre-Civil War history of abolitionism and so forth, but I feel like it was a very strongly religiously rooted movement. Ostensibly, UU was part of that, as well as other aspects of religious
I've got interested
enlightenment
recently,
in that period.
Yeah, in the Transcendentalists of the 1830s
Yeah.
and 40s in New England. Emerson, Thoreau, Theodore Parker, on all of that. And so we'll see if anything
So
comes
I
to that.
think the liberal left has been perhaps too reluctant to bring religion into the debate over war and counter the Christian right in more explicit ways, other than we're dealing now with the problem of the new atheists who turn out to be a lot of warmongers. So there's some weird stuff going on.
That's nothing new. Yes, go ahead.
Well,
Jen.
I was just going to say that during the anti-war movement in Vietnam in the 70s, I found myself on more than one occasion working with Quakers who were certainly very anti-war. Of course, then again, people would point. So I was really embracing that whole movement until it was pointed out to me that, of course, President Nixon was a Quaker. So it obviously didn't affect him. I do have a question, Carl. Maybe I'll put this to you. Noam Chomsky spoke recently. Maybe it wasn't that recent, but he talks about the 100,000 people who were killed in 1965 in Indonesia with our support. I mean, especially given that Eisenhower was bombing them back in 1954 previously because, they were communists. A lot of Chinese and a lot of communists, but also a lot of peasantry. People died. It was pretty horrific. And he made a point to say that the U.S. government actually at that time in '65 thought that as a result of how successful they were in Indonesia, that we could probably end the war in Vietnam.
Right.
But we weren't. I wonder if that was all I picked up on that. I wondered if you cared to.
No, the
What
point that I wanted to
happened?
make was that the U.S.
Yeah.
It's an interesting point about the use of religion in American political propaganda that we've been talking about this evening. But I do think we need to make a distinction between the propagandistic reasons the U.S. government has given for killing 4 million people in Southeast Asia a generation ago and 1 million people or 2 million people in Southwest Asia in the last 15 years. We have to make a distinction between the reasons the U.S. government did that. Why did the U.S. government, in fact, do these things, and the excuses they gave primarily to the American people. The excuses were the ones that involved religion, stopping communism, freeing people, doing good things around the world and so forth. The real reasons were far closer to the sorts of things Stuart was talking about, the economic control, the American economic hegemony over the world, which it had established through the Second World War. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. government, the U.S. economy had half the world's wealth and about 4% of the world's population. And the attempt in our lifetimes to maintain that disparity has been the driving force of American foreign policy. We killed people in Southeast Asia in order to make it clear that no post-colonial nation would be allowed to run its own economy for the purposes of its own people and not coordinate it into the world economy into which the U.S. had incorporated Japan and Indonesia and so forth. And the attempts to remove Japan, Indonesia, or Vietnam from that world economic control that the U.S. exercised were the things that led the U.S. to kill millions of people. Mutatis mutandis, the same thing is true in Southwest Asia. When we look at why the Bush administration invaded Iraq, why the Obama administration continues the Bush wars throughout the region, and continues with the worldwide terrorist campaign that Obama is carrying on at the moment. These people are not stupid. These people do not, they pay more attention to the history than the populations that they need to control. They know very well what they're doing and whose interests they're serving. The interest is primarily the interest of the American 1% and the economic hegemony that that 1% has exercised for about 2 generations now, and to make sure that that continues. And indeed it did in Southeast Asia. I mean, the U.S. finally won that war in spite of certain reverses in that the control of the economy of Southeast Asia is very much in U.S. hands, and that includes Indonesia and Japan as well as Vietnam. So the connection, the important theme that we've been talking about this evening has to be talked about in terms of American propaganda and the real history that David was talking about that lies underneath it. And that's a topic to which I think we should return here. I will post the articles referred to in tonight's session on the Facebook page, or post links to them on the Aware Facebook page, and you can find that there.
If there's time for one comment,
sure.
Regarding, Karen, your article by Mike Whitney and so forth, and just to mention that there's some division on the left as to how to understand what it is that China really wants in terms of whether it really does want to supplant the dollar as the world currency. There's some, like people I respect, Leo Panich and Sam Gindin, who have always taken the tack that America is absolutely economically dominant and China accepts that, but that there's conflicts about what China's role is within that system. And then I guess the question beyond that is whether American militarism somehow has a life of its own and does things that are not necessarily in accordance with the system that American corporations are trying to set up in that part of the world, in which China has by and large gone along with in most ways.
You've been watching Aware on the Air. Our show is produced and directed by Jason Liggett. Thanks to him also, this program and others like it will be available on YouTube. Finally, Aware honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. This is Carl Estabrook for Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, Karen Aram, Michael By, David Johnson, David Green, and other members and friends of Aware, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.